Okay, let's dive right into this. When you hear the title, the Iliad, most of us instantly picture ancient bronze shields, mythological monsters, maybe some towering gods. But today, we're actually going to view this ancient epic through a completely different lens. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're exploring Homer's Iliad, not just as some dusty piece of ancient poetry, but literally as a timeless, Harvard Business School-style operational breakdown of a massive organizational crisis. It's actually kind of mind-blowing to realize we can look at this as a 3,000-year-old operational failure. We're going to explore the psychology of executive pride, the catastrophic friction between top management, and, well, exactly what happens when your absolute most valuable asset stages a hostile withdrawal.
To do this, we're going to break this case study down into 5 phases. 1. The Greek macro environment. 2. The engine of rage. 3. Executive crisis and withdrawal. 4. Vengeance and resolution. And finally, 5. The timeless executive ledger.
All right, starting with Section 1, the Greek macro environment, setting the 8th century BC market stage. Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds. To really grasp this, we have to think of the ancient Mediterranean basin not just as a map in a history book, but as an emerging, rapidly expanding global market. Audiences in the 8th century BC were experiencing this massive cultural renaissance. They were looking way back at the collapse of the late Bronze Age around 1200 BC, right? That was a period of total societal destruction where they kind of mythologized their ancestors as these structural giants and divinely bred heroes. But coming out of those centuries of isolation, the 8th century marked the structural emergence of the independent polis, those sovereign city-states we know, like Athens and Sparta. And this rapid institutional reorganization culminated in massive unifying events like the staging of the first Olympic Games in 776 BC.
Now, alongside this political restructuring came a genuinely monumental technological innovation. Greek merchants established trade with the Phoenicians, and they basically adapted their script by integrating vowels for the very first time in human history. So why does that actually matter? Well, adding vowels allowed for the precise standardized data capture of a rich, superfluid oral poetic tradition that had been passed down for generations. Suddenly, you can actually freeze knowledge. At the exact same time, driven by just huge demographic expansion, Greek city-states were executing a strategy of commercial colonization all across the Mediterranean and Black Seas, consolidating regions like Magna Graecia down in southern Italy. The sea fundamentally evolved into this massive maritime highway, and it wasn't just distributing high-volume trade, it was distributing mythic capital.
Moving on to Section 2, the engine of rage, zooming in on the operational core.
Now, what's really fascinating about this slide is the ongoing academic debate over the author's identity. There's this huge question about who Homer actually was. Was Homer a single, historical blind poet acting as the sole CEO of this narrative? Or is the name Homer actually a functional pseudonym, like essentially a collective corporate identity representing a whole guild of traditional bards, known as aedos, who systematically sang these epics at state banquets to the metric rhythm of a lyre? Honestly, whether it was one brilliant executive or an entire department singing to that beat, the product they delivered was exceptionally focused.
And that focus is absolutely crucial. The absolute operational engine driving the narrative of the Iliad is exclusively the localized rage of Achilles. This text does not attempt to give you a generalized 10-year recap of the entire siege of Troy. That's not what this is. It isn't some broad historical summary. Instead, it acts as a razor-sharp clinical study on the psychology of executive pride, unchecked fury, and the frankly devastating systemic consequences of organizational friction. Which brings us to Section 3. Executive crisis and withdrawal, the clash of top organizational leaders.
Looking at this, there's a massive cognitive dissonance between our idea of these perfect mythic heroes and their reality as deeply flawed corporate managers. On one side, we have King Agamemnon. He's the supreme executive commander of the Greek coalition, and he is profoundly ego-driven. Then on the other side, we have Achilles. He's the coalition's absolute primary military asset, but he's incredibly volatile and intensely prideful. So the friction sparks when Agamemnon, who's feeling his authority threatened, unilaterally reclaims a captive named Briseis from Achilles. And in response, Achilles executes a devastatingly hostile withdrawal of his forces.
Let's walk through the 50 high-stakes days of this crisis step by step, because it escalates fast. Step 1 is the institutional offense. Agamemnon reclaims the captive Briseis. Step 2 is the asset withdrawal. Humiliated, Achilles pulls his military assets completely out of the theater of war, and he literally petitions the gods to let the Greeks suffer so they recognize his immense value to the organization. Step 3 is the severe consequence of that, a massive Trojan offensive. Deprived of their top asset, the Greek network is breached and pushed all the way back to their highly vulnerable beachfront lines. And finally, Step 4 brings the tragedy of Patroclus. Desperate to save the Greek network from total collapse, Achilles' closest advisor, Patroclus, takes Achilles' armor and enters the market. He successfully pushes the Trojans back, but then undergoes fatal combat friction. He's killed by the top Trojan executive asset, Prince Hector.
That leads to Section 4, Vengeance and Resolution, a volatile re-entry into the market.
The fallout of Patroclus' death is just catastrophic. Blinded by overwhelming grief and institutional guilt, Achilles suddenly divests from all of his previous pride. He executes a brutally hostile re-entry into the battlefield. This isn't a calculated military maneuver anymore, guys. It is a volatile, absolute massacre of the Trojan ranks. He specifically targets and eliminates Troy's top executive asset, Prince Hector, in single combat. But here's the thing, the unchecked fury doesn't stop at victory. Achilles completely profanes organizational norms by dragging Hector's corpse beneath the city walls. He's just entirely blinded by his operational grief.
And this brilliantly illustrates the real turning point of the entire case study. In the dark of night, the elderly king Priam of Troy secretly infiltrates the enemy camp. Think about that. He walks right up to the man who just slaughtered his son, and he pleads for the strategic terms of ransom to recover the body. This incredibly bold, super vulnerable move triggers a sudden wave of quiet empathy in Achilles. The volatile warrior is diffused. Not by force, not by leverage, but by a shared recognition of human grief and mortality. It's this deeply humanizing resolution to what had been a totally catastrophic operational crisis. And finally, Section 5, the timeless executive ledger, defining the metrics of legacy.
To truly understand why these characters acted the way they did throughout all of this, we really have to look at their cultural performance metrics. The first vital metric here is time. This was essentially a baseline metric of battlefield honor and institutional socio-political status. So when Agamemnon unilaterally reclaimed Briseis, he wasn't just taking a captive away, right? He was directly slashing Achilles' time. It was a profound, highly public attack on Achilles' compensation package and his socio-political ego. Understanding this completely recontextualizes the severity of that initial institutional offense, but the ultimate operational objective, the real bottom line for these guys, is our second metric, kleos. So, the crucial point is, for the elite actors of the Iliad, physical life is an inherently finite asset. I mean, you're going to die. Therefore, the primary operational objective, the ultimate goal they are chasing, is the acquisition of kleos, eternal legacy.
As we can see here, Achilles ultimately faces a conscious executive trade-off. It's a binary choice. He could choose an extended, anonymous existence. That means a long asset lifespan, but absolutely zero legacy in the market metric of kleos, or he could choose a compressed, glorious life, a really short physical lifespan, but maximum eternal legacy. As a driven elite actor, Achilles consciously chooses the compressed life. He essentially trades longevity for absolute market dominance and legacy.
This choice highlights a genuinely fascinating structural contrast in the text. You have the Olympian deities acting essentially like immortal upper management. They take corporate sides, they maneuver with petty vanity, and they display these volatile, childlike emotions. Why? Because they have absolutely no real skin in the game. They literally don't die. In contrast, mortal human employees achieve a far superior structural dignity. And why is that? Precisely because their physical assets expire. Mortality creates scarcity, and scarcity creates value. Every single strategic choice, every sacrifice a mortal makes under the weight of destiny, or moira, has absolute, unrepeatable value.
And really, this is exactly why the Iliad endured as the structural civic ledger of the Hellenic world. It was the foundational text for elite literacy, military strategy, and political governance. The lessons of organizational friction in this text were so potent that, centuries later, Alexander the Great actually maintained an executive copy of this very story beneath his pillow to inform his own global campaigns. And even today, literally 3,000 years later, it remains this elite reference point for analyzing flawed leadership and behavioral psychology under severe friction.
We've seen how top-level friction, misaligned metrics, and unchecked executive pride brought an entire coalition to its knees, costing them immense baseline assets. So I want to leave you with this to consider. As you look at the landscape of your own organizations, how might ego-driven disputes and executive pride be bottlenecking your own corporate structures today? It's a 3,000-year-old question for sure, but the answer might just dictate your legacy. Thanks for exploring this with me today, and I'll see you on the next one.